I'm going to talk to you tonight about life and death. Are you alive?
Yes.
How do you know? Is it because you're hearing me? Maybe it's because your heart is beating, right? Or maybe it's because your brain is processing what I'm saying right now. Or maybe you don't exactly know why it is that you're alive, but one thing you do know, right, I assume, is that you're not dead. Okay? Now this would be a logical approach for you to assume that life and death are in fact opposites. But frankly, under the law, if you made that assumption, and please pardon the pun, you would be dead wrong. Because the law does not in fact treat life and death as opposites. It treats them completely independently of each other. Now, I've asked you whether or not you're alive, and we've already assumed that the law of life and death does not assume that they're opposites. There's a good reason for that. And that is that we can't, as a society, agree upon a definition of life. For all the reasons that you would assume. There's just too many politics swirling around that. So, in fact, what we have is a definition of death that has nothing at all to do with the definition of life. In fact, we just don't have a definition of life. But here's the good news. Since everybody in the room has been born, at least I'm going to assume that again, congratulations. Under the law, you are a person. It's a way of avoiding the issue of life altogether. But you're a person, so that means you're entitled to all the constitutional and statutory protections that persons are entitled to. But here's the rub, and we all know the rub, right? Everybody who's born, one day, is going to die. And the thing is that the law can't equivocate on the definition of death the way it has with the definition of life. There's no maybe you're dead or maybe you're not dead. There are certain moments when the law has to definitively decide whether you're dead or not. For example, for wills or intestacy statutes to kick in, we have to have someone who's dead so that we can distribute their estate. If you have a life insurance contract, for those proceeds to be paid out, you have to first die. For prosecutions for murder to take place, or for tort actions for something like wrongful death to ensue, we have to first have someone who has definitively died. So what you find is that the law has, in fact, come up with a definition of death. In fact, it's come up with two different definitions of death. There's something called the Uniform Determination of Death Act, or UDDA. This is not a federal law. It is a model law that's been adopted since 1980 in all of the 50 states. There's some variations from state to state, but the good news is, for the most part, these are the two legal definitions of death that you will face. You're going to meet one definition or the other one day. Most of us are going to die from number one. Number one is an irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. Good old-fashioned cardiopulmonary death. The second kind of death is sort of the new kid on the block. It's an irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. Brain death, in other words. Now, the thing about cardiopulmonary death, we'll take that one first, is that it's pretty easy to diagnose. Right? In fact, anybody in the room can probably diagnose cardiopulmonary death. You put a mirror under someone's nose and see if it fogs up. Right? You can check their pulse. You could get a little fancier. You could use a stethoscope, or you could use a cardiac monitor, and you would be able to quickly tell whether or not the cardiopulmonary function has stopped. But remember, it can't just be stopped. It has to be irreversibly stopped. So time is the ambiguity here. And it's particularly the ambiguity in the context of what's called donation after cardiac death, or DCD. Donation after cardiac death is what it sounds like. It is when you decide to donate your organs after you've died of cardiopulmonary death. And believe it or not, the way we get most organs is not through DCD, donation after cardiopulmonary death, but after brain death, for reasons I'll talk about in just a minute. But we can't get enough good organs from brain dead patients. So we have a severe shortage of good organs. And there's been increasing pressure in recent years to try to harvest some of the organs from people who die of cardiopulmonary death. And that's where DCD comes into play. Now, the problem with DCD, as you can imagine, is that it's not so good for organ donation. because by definition you have to wait for the heart and the lungs to stop, and you have to wait a certain period of time to make sure they're dead, that it's irreversible. And as you wait that time, of course, the entire time the organs are deteriorating rapidly. Organs don't do so good if they're not perfused with oxygen. So the question is, how long do we wait after we call cardiopulmonary cessation before we can declare them dead and take their organs? Well, you might be interested in something called the Lazarus syndrome. The Lazarus syndrome is what it sounds like. It is the phenomenon where people sort of rise from the dead, right? Where they spontaneously auto-resuscitate. And the medical literature suggests that this Lazarus syndrome can take place generally within 15 minutes of cessation of cardiopulmonary function. And you would think, well, gosh, wouldn't it make sense to have a DCD protocol that says you have to wait 15 minutes, you have to have a 15-minute stand-down period before you harvest the organs? Well, that would be too long. If you wait 15 minutes, frankly, the organs are going to have deteriorated so much that you're not going to get any usable organs. Certainly the more sensitive organs will be long gone. So what you find is that institution by institution in the United States, we have different standoff periods for donation after cardiac death. Now notice what I said, institution by institution. What that's telling you is that the law is actually not standardizing this. This is left to the discretion of the medical profession, and it varies wildly from institution to institution. So, for example, the most typical, not the most typical, but one of the more typical standoff periods is 10 minutes. That's what Europe has in its mastery protocol, for example. But guess what? There's a lot of other protocols out there. Many of them choose 5 minutes before organs can be harvested after cessation of cardiopulmonary function. Others require 2 minutes. Still others require 75 seconds before organs can be harvested. Now you can see that a protocol that chooses 75 seconds is pushing the envelope of what it means to be irreversibly lost in your cardiopulmonary function, and therefore also pushing the envelope of legality, but it is what it is at the moment. And I'll wrap up cardiopulmonary death with one story, Howard Snitzer. Howard Snitzer was 54 years old when he collapsed in early 2011 outside the grocery store in Minnesota. He had a heart attack. And he was flown to the closest hospital where they provided him electric shock and cardiopulmonary resuscitation for many minutes. And finally the doctors gave up and they declared him dead. Well, there was a nurse in the room who had recently received some continuing medical education credits in something called capnography. And this is a way of monitoring basically carbon dioxide levels in a very fine fashion. And she thought when she looked at the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Snitzer that it showed some possible signs of very shallow respiration. It wasn't showing up at a pulse. They didn't have a heartbeat. That was long gone. But she thought there was enough indicia that they ought to keep trying. So she told her colleagues, let's keep trying, and she convinced them to do so. They, in fact, then proceeded to provide CPR to Mr. Snitzer for 96 minutes. And in minute 97, guess what? They got a pulse. Now, I'm going to switch gears and talk about brain death. Again, new kid on the block here. This is not how most of us are going to die, but it's important, certainly, for organ donations. When we talk about brain death, we're talking about death of the entire brain. And there's basically sort of two big structures here. There's the sort of squiggly, worm-like looking gray matter. That's the cerebrum, or the higher brain. That's where your sort of cognition is located, your memories. It sort of makes you who you are, that higher brain. And then there's the funny-looking lower brain part, kind of looks like a nautilus shell, a little twig at the bottom. And that lower brain, that's the cerebellum and brainstem, by the way, and that lower brain is sort of the more primitive, animalistic side of our brain, because it regulates these sort of automatic functions that we don't have to think about, like respiration, for example. Now, what happened that caused us to suddenly recognize brain death, whole brain death, beginning in the late 1960s? Well, in 1968, a committee of the Harvard Medical School decided that they wanted to find a way to get more organs for organ transplantation. So they recommended brain death as the possible solution. And then 2 years later, in 1970, the first state passed a brain death statute. That was Kansas. And then by 1980, we get the Uniform Determination of Death Act with brain death as a formal legal recognition. And the impetus for all of this was sort of a perfect storm of advancing technology and advancing surgical techniques. On the technology side, you had in the late 1950s and early 1960s the development of technology like ventilators and heart-lung machines. And what these could do is keep our hearts pumping and our lungs breathing for us where they hadn't been able to before. And notice that when that happens too, we can't call cardiopulmonary death anymore, any more than we can call cardiopulmonary death just because somebody has a pacemaker, right? So we were having people kept alive and avoiding cardiopulmonary death by the technology. And at the same time, in the late 1950s, we had the first successful organ transplants. And then by the late 1960s, we had perfected those techniques for organ transplants sufficiently so that we thought to ourselves, gosh, if only we had a better supply of organs. If we had a better supply of organs, we could actually save a tremendous number of lives. And this is where brain death comes into play. Brain death is, by definition, a way of declaring death when someone is on a ventilator. And they're on the ventilator and their brain is gone. They're not with us anymore. And what that allows us to do by saying they're not with us anymore and therefore are dead, it allows us to take the scalpel, cut down the chest, take out the organs while they're still on the ventilator. They're pink and they're rosy and they're breathing. And why are we doing that? We're doing that because those organs are the freshest organs you can possibly have. They're utterly perfused with oxygen. And so they're the perfect types of organs for organ transplantation. Now, I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking to you about what is not brain death, because there are a lot of misconceptions. There are a lot of situations where people's higher brain is functioning, but they kind of look dead. We know coma is not dead, for example. People who are in a coma have simply lost consciousness. They are no longer aware of their surroundings. The locked-in syndrome you may not have heard about before. There's been some interesting books written by people who are in locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome is when you're completely conscious, unlike coma patients. But you are utterly unable to communicate with the world at large. You are locked into your body because you are completely paralyzed. And in fact, the only ability to move that locked-in patients may have, and some of them have it and some of them don't, is the ability to blink your eyes or move your eyes laterally slightly. And you can imagine that these locked-in patients are often misdiagnosed as vegetative state, which I'll talk about in 2 seconds. And then the minimally conscious state is actually a new diagnosis. In the 21st century, we just discovered this minimally conscious state. What is it? It is, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of like flicking a light switch on and off. It's sporadic, unpredictable sort of flashes of consciousness. We don't know when those flashes are going to occur. We don't know when the switch is going to flip up and when it's going to flip down, but it does, and therefore, clearly they have some higher brain functioning and therefore are not dead. They're also misdiagnosed often as being in the vegetative state. What is the vegetative state? Well, I've got a picture there of Terri Schiavo. She's probably the most well-known vegetative state, at least in recent years. Some of you who are more like my age probably remember Karen Ann Quinlan from the 1970s, who's also a famous vegetative state patient. When the vegetative state goes on long enough, it's called permanent vegetative state, or PVS. What is it? It is basically the situation where the higher brain, the cerebrum, has completely stopped functioning, but the lower brain is on, and therefore they're not dead. And when you have continued function of the lower brain, what happens is that you have continuation of reflexes that are mediated through that brain stem. So, for example, PDS patients will continue to have normal sleep-wake cycles. If you go into the room during the day, they'll be awake. If you go into the room at night, they'll look like they're asleep. They often don't need a respirator. You can see Ms. Schiavo didn't need a respirator. Sometimes they have enough function of the brainstem not to need a respirator. Sometimes they can even swallow. They have the swallowing reflex intact, so they'd be able to take food. They have a startle reflex that's still intact, which means you go into the room and you clap your hands real loud and they'll flinch, because that's a brainstem-mediated reflex. Okay, but so we know what brain death is, and what is brain death, and how do we diagnose it? Boy, that's harder than you think. It's harder than you think. There's no magic machine out there that says, aha, the brain is dead. There are some machines that can help, at least with higher brain function. So you can hook somebody up to an EEG, an electroencephalogram, which basically gives you a reading of the electrical energy of the brain, the higher brain. You can also perform PET scans or angiography, which will tell you if you're getting cerebral blood flow to the higher brain. But all of these diagnostic tools right now that you're seeing on this slide are only going to help you tell you if the higher brain is functioning. It won't tell you a thing about the lower brain. And that's the problem. The lower brain is the tricky part, so to speak. To diagnose lower brain death, if you will, requires a series of bedside tests. Very difficult to read the test often, and they have to be repeated over a period of time to give you any confidence that what the answer that you're getting is correct. So you do all these tests for reflexes that, again, are mediated through the brain stem. One of them is called the doll's eye reflex, where you literally move the head back and forth very quickly to see which way the eyes move. The corneal reflex, where you put a little cotton swab in the eye to see if you get a little blink reflex. The pupillary reflex, you shine a light in the eye and see what the pupil does. The startle reflex, which I spoke about before. And then there's this one called the oculovestibular reflex, which is basically where you they test it by pouring cold water into the ear and seeing if the eyes move toward the irrigated ear. Now, the problem with these tests, as you can imagine, is that sometimes they yield positive results and sometimes they yield negative results. These reflexes sometimes come and go. It takes a lot of training to be able to perform these tests and get an accurate answer. And the law doesn't standardize this stuff. So what tests you provide, which reflexes you test for, how many times you test for them, and more importantly, I think, who tests for them is not specified by the law. I think, personally, the best people you want to be providing these reflex tests for lower brain functioning would be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, someone who, through the residency, has some training in these particular reflexes. But that certainly is not required by law and does not, in fact, normally happen. And I'll end with, again, an instance of misdiagnosis. The medical community often claims that there are no brain death misdiagnoses. That's absolutely not true. The case of Zach Dunlap is the case in point. Mr. Dunlap was a 21-year-old when he was riding an ATV without a helmet. And he got into a horrible accident, and he was flown to the nearest trauma center, and they observed him for 36 hours. They provided multiple PET scans to check for the higher brain function, and they did a series of clinical bedside tests to check for lower brain function. And they concluded at the end of all of that that he was, in fact, brain dead. And Mr. Dunlap was an organ donor. He had the organ donation on his driver's license. So they began preparing him for organ donation. They, in fact, called the team from a nearby city and started flying them in by helicopter to harvest Mr. Dunlap's organ. And they told the parents to say their goodbyes. So the family was called in. One family member was a cousin who was a nurse. And this cousin was saying his goodbyes to Zach, and he had a funny feeling that Zach wasn't dead. So he took out a pocket knife and he ran it along the back, the sole of Zach's foot. And he got a flinch reaction. And he told the nurse, and the nurse said, "Oh, it's just a reflex, he's gone." And this cousin was not about to give up. So the cousin then went to Zach's hand and put pressure on his fingernails, which elicited a pain reflex so strong that Zach pulled his arm away. The nurse saw that one, and the nurse knew that that was a sign of life. And they stopped preparation for organs. 48 days later, organ harvesting, 48 days later, he walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet. And as you can see, he was well enough to give an interview with the Terri Schiavo. Okay. finally, in conclusion, I just wanted to talk to you tonight about how death is not always as clear-cut as you may have assumed. That, in fact, we have to be able to admit that mistakes are made. And there is a role for law here, that we need to try to standardize not just the definition of death, which we've already done, but how do we apply the definition in specific contexts to minimize these mistakes. One thing we certainly need to try to do is standardize the personnel who is allowed to make a diagnosis, particularly in brain death. And to also try as much as we can to standardize the minimum tests that need to be provided in the period of time over which those tests need to be provided. But, of course, to do any of this as a legal matter, we have to have first medical consensus, because this is not the bailiwick of lawyers, it's the bailiwick of medical professionals. But the legal reforms will certainly follow once that medical consensus is reached. And frankly, I think we have to have these reforms if we're going to have continued public confidence in organ donation. And I'll try to leave you with a good note, which is this: we're not dead yet, right? So go out and live. Thank you very much.